At my son's anniversary party, I realized my name didn't belong on the family list anymore. I noticed it the moment I stepped up to the check-in table, the kind with neatly arranged cards in alphabetical order, each one printed on thick cream paper with elegant gold lettering, the kind that tells you this event was planned down to the last detail, the kind that leaves no room for mistakes, and yet somehow, my card still managed to feel like one. I picked it up slowly, careful not to draw attention. My fingers steady even though something cold had already begun to settle in my chest. And I read it twice just to make sure I wasn't imagining things, just to give myself the benefit of doubt that perhaps age had blurred my eyes or the lighting was playing tricks on me. But no, it was clear as day, unmistakable, printed in the same careful script as every other guest. Margaret Collins, guest, family friend. And for a brief moment, I simply stood there, the sounds of laughter and soft music from the ballroom drifting toward me, glasses clinking, voices overlapping in cheerful tones, all of it continuing as if nothing was wrong, as if everything was exactly as it should be, while I held a small piece of paper that quietly erased decades of my life. I could have said something right then, could have walked back to the young woman at the table and pointed out the mistake, asked her to fix it, but I didn't, because something about it didn't feel like a mistake, not really. Not when I thought about how deliberate everything else looked, how carefully orchestrated the entire evening was, from the seating arrangements to the floral centerpieces, from the guest list to the lighting, and suddenly, the idea that this single detail had slipped through unnoticed felt less like an accident and more like a decision, one that had been made quietly, perhaps even casually, but with intention all the same. I adjusted the card between my fingers, then pinned it onto my dress, smoothing the fabric as if nothing had changed, as if the word guest didn't sit there heavier than it should, and then I walked inside. The ballroom was beautiful, I'll give them that, soft amber lights reflecting off polished floors, round tables draped in white linen, each one set with crystal glasses and silverware that caught the light just right, and at the center of it all, Daniel and Emily stood greeting guests, smiling, laughing, playing their parts perfectly, my son looking every bit the successful man he'd worked so hard to become, and Emily, poised as always, her hand resting lightly on his arm as if she belonged there. As if she had always belonged there, and maybe she had, at least in the version of the family they were presenting tonight. I approached them slowly, my heels soft against the floor, and when Daniel saw me, his smile flickered for just a fraction of a second before returning, polished and practiced. "Mom, you made it," he said, leaning in for a quick hug that felt more like a formality than anything else, while Emily offered me that same warm smile she had perfected over the years, the one that never quite reached her eyes. "Margaret, you look lovely," she added, her voice smooth, effortless, and I nodded, thanking her, as if nothing at all was out of place, as if I hadn't just been quietly reintroduced into my own family as something less than what I had always been. I moved through the room after that, exchanging greetings, returning smiles, taking my seat when I found it, though it wasn't at the table I expected, not near Daniel, not near the center, but off to the side with distant acquaintances and extended connections, people who knew me only through polite introductions and second-hand stories, and I sat there, hands folded lightly in my lap, listening to conversations that drifted past me without ever quite including me, and I realized something then, something that settled into place with a clarity that surprised even me. This wasn't new, not really, it had been happening in smaller ways for years, the missed calls, the last-minute changes, the quiet shifts that placed me just a little further away each time, but tonight, it was no longer subtle, no longer something I could explain away or ignore. Tonight, it was written in ink and handed to me at the door, and for the first time, I didn't feel confused by it. I didn't feel the need to question whether I was overthinking or being too sensitive, because the truth was simple, clean in a way that almost felt relieving. They had decided where I belonged, and it was no longer with them, and as I sat there, watching my own family celebrate without ever really looking my way, I found myself doing something unexpected, something quiet and small. I smiled, not out of politeness this time, not out of habit, but because somewhere beneath the surface of that moment, something had shifted, something steady and unshakable, and I understood, very clearly, That if they no longer saw me as part of their world, then I no longer had any reason to hold theirs together. I stayed at that table longer than I needed to, long enough to notice the way conversations flowed around me without ever quite including me, long enough to see how easily people accepted the roles they had been assigned for the evening, and how naturally I had been placed just outside of everything that mattered. Across the room, Daniel raised a glass during a quiet toast, his voice steady and confident as he spoke about success. About building a life together, about the importance of family. And the word lingered in the air longer than it should have, as if it meant something fixed and permanent, as if it could not be quietly redefined without anyone noticing, and I watched the guests nod along, smiling, while Emily stood beside him with that same composed expression, her hand resting lightly at his side, guiding the rhythm of the evening without ever appearing to do so. I followed the direction of her gaze more than once, noticing how she scanned the room, how she adjusted small details with a glance or a subtle gesture, the placement of a chair, the timing of a server, even the order in which people approached the couple, and it became clear to me that nothing here was left to chance, not the lighting, not the seating, and certainly not the names printed on those cards at the entrance. I reached for my glass, taking a small sip just to give myself something to do, something to ground me in the moment. And that was when I heard it, not loud, not meant for me, but close enough that I could not pretend otherwise. Two women standing just behind my chair, their voices low but careless in that way people can be when they believe they are speaking safely among themselves, one of them saying, "Emily has really stepped up, she practically runs everything now." And the other responding with a soft laugh. "Well, someone had to, you know how it is, older generations have a hard time letting go." And I did not turn around, I did not interrupt, I simply let the words settle where they landed, because they were not cruel on the surface, not openly disrespectful, but they carried something underneath, something that felt far more intentional than simple observation. I placed my glass back down carefully, aligning it with the edge of the table as if that small act of precision could restore some kind of balance, and I found myself thinking back, not just to tonight, but to the quiet shifts that had led here. The times Daniel had cancelled our weekly lunches with short messages about being busy, the holidays that had been rearranged to better suit Emily's family, the decisions that had been made and then explained to me afterward as if my role was to understand rather than to be involved, and each memory on its own had been easy to dismiss, easy to excuse, but together they formed a pattern that was no longer subtle, no longer accidental. Across the room, Emily leaned in to speak with one of the event coordinators, her expression calm but decisive, and I watched as the young woman nodded quickly, adjusting something on her tablet before hurrying off, and it struck me then how comfortable Emily had become in this role, how naturally she occupied the center of everything that once felt shared, and how little space had been left for me without ever being formally taken away. I shifted slightly in my seat, glancing down at the card still pinned to my dress, the word guest, catching the light in a way that made it impossible to ignore, and for the first time that evening, I allowed myself to acknowledge what I had been holding back, not anger, not even sadness, but a kind of clarity that felt almost clinical in its precision. This was not about a single event. It was not about a misplaced card or an oversight at the door. It was about a quiet restructuring that had been happening piece by piece, decision by decision, until the foundation itself had changed without anyone needing to announce it. I looked up again just as Daniel laughed at something one of his colleagues had said, his posture relaxed, his attention fully engaged in the world in front of him. And I realized with a calm certainty that he did not see it, not fully, or perhaps he chose not to, because seeing it would require acknowledging the cost of what had been built, and for a moment, I wondered if I should say something, if I should stand up, walk across that room, and remind him of everything that had come before, everything that had made this moment possible. But the thought passed as quickly as it came, because the truth was, anything said in that room would have been absorbed, redirected, softened into something manageable. Something that fit the narrative already in place, and I was no longer interested in fitting into a narrative that had been written without me. Instead, I did what I had done at the entrance. I remained exactly where I was, quiet, composed, observing, because if this evening had taught me anything, It was that the most important decisions were not the ones announced out loud, they were the ones made quietly, carefully, and carried out without drawing attention. And as I sat there, watching the structure of my own family unfold in front of me with a clarity I had never allowed myself before, I began to understand that whatever came next would not require an argument, it would not require confrontation, it would only require patience, and the willingness to let everything continue exactly as they intended, right up until the moment it no longer could. Later that evening, I found myself standing near the edge of the ballroom, just far enough from the center to see everything clearly, yet far enough to remain unnoticed, and it was there, in that quiet distance, that the final pieces began to settle into place. Emily was speaking with a small group near the stage, her voice calm, controlled, the kind that carries authority without needing to rise, and Daniel stood beside her, nodding occasionally, smiling at the right moments, but not leading, not guiding, simply following the rhythm she had already set, and I watched as one of the guests, an older man I vaguely recognized from Daniel's work, leaned in and said something that made Emily laugh softly before she replied. "We have been making some changes, streamlining things, making sure everything is where it should be." And the way she said it, the ease in her tone, suggested ownership, not participation, as if she had already stepped into a role that no one had formally given her, but no one had stopped her from taking either. I moved a little closer, not enough to be seen as listening, but enough to hear the next part, the part that mattered. "It is easier when everyone understands their place," she added, her words light, almost casual, yet carrying a weight that lingered long after they were spoken, and there was a brief pause, a moment where the others nodded in agreement, where Daniel glanced at her with something that looked like approval, and I felt that same quiet clarity return, sharper now, more defined, because it was no longer about implication or assumption, it was being said, just not directly to me. I stepped back again, allowing the space between us to widen, and as I did, I found my thoughts drifting to the house, the one Daniel had grown up in. The one his father and I had built together over more than 30 years, every room holding a memory, every corner shaped by decisions we had made side by side, and I thought about the recent conversations, the subtle suggestions that it might be too much for me now, that perhaps something smaller, something easier to manage, would be better, and at the time, I had heard concern in those words, or at least I had chosen to, but standing there now, with Emily's voice still echoing in my mind, I understood them differently, not as concern, but as preparation, a gradual shift designed to feel reasonable, even kind, while moving everything toward a conclusion that had already been decided. I returned to my seat for a moment, not because I needed to, but because it gave me a chance to observe one last detail, the place cards arranged neatly on the table, each one marking a position, a role, a place within the structure of the evening, and I realized how fitting that was, how everything here was about placement, about who stood where, who spoke, who followed, who belonged, and who did not, and I reached up briefly, touching the edge of my own card where it was pinned to my dress, not adjusting it this time, just acknowledging it for what it was, a quiet declaration that required no further explanation. Across the room, Daniel caught my eye for a brief second, offering a small smile, one that felt distant, polite, and I returned it just as calmly, because there was nothing left to question, nothing left to confirm. The pattern was complete, the intention clear, and for the first time, I felt no urge to correct it, no need to remind anyone of who I had been or what I had done. Because that version of the story no longer held any value here. Instead, I stood slowly, smoothing my dress once more, and began to make my way toward the exit, not in a hurry, not with any sense of urgency, but with a quiet certainty that settled deeper with each step, because while they were still speaking, still planning, still adjusting the world around them to fit their vision, they had not yet realized one simple truth: the structure they were building depended on something they no longer understood. Something they had already started to take for granted, and as I stepped out into the cool night air, the noise of the ballroom fading behind me, I allowed myself a small, steady breath, not of relief, not of sadness, but of recognition, because from this point forward, I would not need to argue for a place that had already been taken from me. I would simply decide what remained standing when everything else had been quietly moved out from under them. The drive home felt longer than usual, even though the roads were familiar and the distance had not changed in over 20 years. But something about the quiet inside the car made every mile feel more deliberate, as if I was crossing an invisible line that I could not step back over once I reached the other side. When I pulled into the driveway, the house stood exactly as I had left it, the porch light still on, the curtains drawn just enough to keep the interior dim, and for a moment I sat there with my hands resting on the steering wheel, looking at it not as a place of comfort, but as something that had suddenly become very clear in its importance, not just as a home, but as a piece of a larger structure that others had already begun to calculate without fully understanding. I stepped inside slowly, closing the door behind me with a soft click that echoed more than it should have in the quiet hallway, and I did not turn on any lights right away, instead letting my eyes adjust to the dim glow from the street outside, because I wanted to see it this way, unaltered, unchanged, exactly as it had been before anyone else had started deciding what it should become. I walked through each room without rushing. The living room with its worn but carefully maintained furniture, the dining area where so many dinners had been shared over the years, the kitchen where routines had once felt automatic and unquestioned, and as I moved through the space, I was not overwhelmed by emotion, not in the way people expect. There were no tears, no sudden bursts of nostalgia, only a steady awareness of how much of this had been built intentionally, how many decisions had gone into creating something stable, something lasting, and how easily others had begun to speak about it as if it were simply a resource waiting to be reassigned. I paused at the staircase, resting my hand lightly on the banister, and for a brief moment I allowed myself to remember Daniel as a boy, running down those steps 2 at a time, his laughter filling the house in a way that made everything feel alive, and I wondered, not for the first time, when that sense of connection had started to fade, when the space between us had become something that could be managed, adjusted, and eventually reduced to polite conversations and scheduled visits. But the question did not linger, because it no longer mattered in the way it once had. The answers would not change what had already been set in motion. Instead, I turned and made my way into the study, a room that had always felt separate from the rest of the house, quieter, more deliberate, the place where important things were kept, not just physically, but in terms of decisions, records, the kind of details that most people overlook until they need them. And I sat down at the desk, opening the drawer where documents had been neatly organized for years, not out of suspicion, but out of habit. Because order had always been something I valued, something I relied on. I pulled out a folder slowly, flipping through pages that outlined ownership, agreements, structures that had been put in place long before anyone had thought to question them, and as I read, I felt that same clarity return, stronger now, grounded in something tangible. Something that did not depend on interpretation or perception, because while conversations could shift and roles could be redefined, these details remained exactly as they had been written, precise, unambiguous, and entirely within my control. I closed the folder carefully, placing it back in the drawer with the same attention I had always given it, and then I sat there for a moment longer, not thinking about what had already happened, but about what would come next. Because the pattern I had seen that evening was not just about exclusion, it was about assumption, the quiet belief that everything important had already been accounted for, that the outcome was inevitable. And that was where the real mistake had been made. I stood up. Then, turning off the small lamp on the desk before leaving the room, and as I moved back through the house, I no longer saw it as something fragile or at risk, but as something solid, something that had been built with a level of care that could not be undone by a few carefully chosen words or a rearranged seating chart. And as I made my way upstairs, the silence no longer felt empty, it felt deliberate. Like a pause before something important, and for the first time since that evening began, I allowed myself a quiet, steady understanding, not of loss, but of position, because whatever they believed was already theirs, whatever plans they had started to make, they were all built on a foundation they had never truly examined, and when that foundation shifted, it would not require confrontation or explanation, it would simply reveal itself, and by then, there would be nothing left for me to say. The next morning began the same way it always had, with quiet sunlight filtering through the kitchen window and the soft hum of the refrigerator filling the space. But something beneath that routine had shifted, something subtle yet unmistakable, and I moved through the motions with a precision that felt more deliberate than habitual, setting a cup of coffee on the counter, aligning it with the edge as if even the smallest detail deserved attention now, as if order itself had become a form of clarity. I did not rush. I did not reach for the phone or check for messages, because I already knew what I would find: polite follow-ups, perhaps a casual thank you for attending, maybe even a suggestion about meeting later in the week, all of it wrapped in the same tone of normalcy that had defined the evening before, and I found that I was no longer interested in responding to that version of things, not yet. Because what mattered now was not what was being said, but what had already been understood. I carried my coffee into the study, the same room where I had sat the night before, and this time I turned on the light, letting it fill the space fully, illuminating the desk, the shelves, the neatly organized files that had been part of my life for decades, and I sat down again, opening the same drawer, but with a different intention, not to confirm what I already knew, but to begin arranging what would come next. The documents were familiar, their edges worn just enough to show. They had been handled over time, but never carelessly, and as I reviewed them one by one, I noticed details that had once felt routine now carrying a different weight: ownership structures, signatures, dates, clauses that had been written with foresight rather than urgency, and I realized how much of this had been designed not just for the present, but for moments exactly like this. Moments when clarity would matter more than assumption. I paused when I reached a particular section, reading it slowly, not because it was complicated, but because it confirmed something important, something that had been quietly overlooked by everyone else: the idea that control did not always sit where people expected it to, that what appeared straightforward on the surface often rested on layers that required more than casual attention to understand, and I allowed that realization to settle without reacting to it. Because there was no need for urgency, no need to act quickly or dramatically. Everything that needed to happen could unfold at its own pace. I closed the folder and reached for another, this one containing more recent records, updates that had been made over the years as circumstances changed, and I thought about how easily those changes had been accepted by others without question, how naturally people assumed that access equaled ownership, that proximity equaled authority, and how little anyone had considered the possibility that those assumptions might not hold when examined more closely. Outside, a car passed slowly along the street, its sound fading as quickly as it came, and I found myself listening to the quiet again, not as emptiness, but as space to think, to arrange, to decide without interruption or influence. And in that space, a plan did not form all at once, it did not arrive as a single clear idea, but rather as a series of small, precise adjustments. Each one simple on its own, but together creating something that could not be easily undone. I stood up after a while, carrying the folders back to their place, making sure everything was exactly as it had been, not out of habit this time, but out of intention, because nothing needed to appear different, nothing needed to signal that anything had changed. And as I stepped out of the study, I glanced once more toward the rest of the house, the quiet rooms, the familiar layout, the life that had been built here over so many years, and I understood that while others had already begun imagining what would happen next, they had done so without fully understanding what they were building on. I returned to the kitchen, finishing the last of my coffee before rinsing the cup and placing it carefully in the sink, every movement steady, measured, as if each action reinforced the same quiet decision, and by the time I reached for my keys, there was no hesitation left, no lingering doubt, only a clear sense of direction, not outwardly visible, not something anyone else could point to or question, but something firmly in place all the same, because whatever they believed they had already secured, whatever future they had begun to picture for themselves, it would unfold exactly as planned, just not in the way they expected. The office building had not changed in years, the same polished glass doors, the same quiet lobby with its neutral tones and soft lighting designed to put people at ease, and as I stepped inside, I was greeted by the familiar scent of polished wood and fresh paper, a scent I had always associated with clarity, with decisions that were made carefully and documented precisely. The receptionist looked up and offered a polite smile, one of recognition rather than curiosity, and I returned it with the same calm expression I had carried with me since the night before, giving my name without hesitation, knowing it would be expected, knowing that my presence here would not raise questions, only confirmation. I took a seat in the waiting area, my hands resting lightly in my lap, observing the small details around me, the neatly arranged magazines, the quiet ticking of a clock mounted just above the hallway, the distant murmur of voices behind closed doors, all of it steady, controlled. Nothing like the shifting dynamics I had left behind, and for a moment, I allowed myself to appreciate that difference, because here, things did not rely on assumptions, they relied on what was written, what was agreed upon, what could be traced and verified without interpretation. When my name was called, I stood and followed the assistant down the hallway, each step measured, each movement aligned with the quiet certainty that had been building since that evening, and when I entered the office, I was met by a man who had known me for many years, someone who had handled matters for my husband and me long before any of this had begun to unfold, and he greeted me with the same professional warmth he always had, though there was a brief pause in his expression, a subtle recognition that something about this meeting carried more weight than usual. I sat down across from him, placing my bag carefully on the chair beside me, and for a moment neither of us spoke, not out of hesitation, but out of understanding, because conversations like this did not begin with urgency. They began with clarity, and when I finally did speak, my voice was steady, measured. Not driven by emotion, but by intention, I explained what I needed in simple terms, without embellishment, without unnecessary detail, focusing only on what mattered, what needed to be reviewed, what needed to be adjusted, and as I spoke, I watched his expression shift slightly, not in surprise, but in concentration, as he followed the structure of what I was outlining. He asked a few questions, precise, targeted, the kind that ensured everything was aligned correctly, and I answered them just as directly, because there was nothing uncertain about what I was doing, nothing left to interpret, and when he turned to his computer, pulling up the relevant documents, I felt that same grounded clarity settle even deeper, because now it was no longer just a realization, it was becoming something tangible, something that would exist beyond conversation, beyond perception. We reviewed everything carefully, line by line, not rushing, not skipping over details, because this was not something to be done quickly, it was something to be done correctly, and as adjustments were discussed, as options were outlined, I chose each one with the same deliberate precision I had applied to everything else, not out of reaction, but out of understanding, because what mattered now was not what had already happened, but what would remain in place when everything else shifted, when the final steps were explained, when the process was set in motion. There was a brief moment of silence, not uncomfortable, but reflective, and he looked at me with a quiet professionalism, asking if there was anything else I needed, and I considered the question carefully before shaking my head, because there was nothing more to add, nothing more to change. Everything that needed to be addressed had already been accounted for. I stood then, gathering my things with the same calm attention I had maintained throughout, and as I left the office, stepping back into the hallway, I did not feel any sense of finality, no dramatic shift, only a continuation of the same steady path I had stepped onto the night before, because this was not an ending. It was a realignment, a quiet correction that did not require announcement or acknowledgement. Outside, the air felt cool and clear, the kind that sharpens the senses without overwhelming them, and as I walked toward my car, I allowed myself one brief thought, not of what Daniel or Emily would say, not of how they would react, but of how easily they had mistaken access for ownership, how confidently they had begun to build something on a foundation they had never truly examined, and I understood, with a certainty that no longer needed to be questioned, that when that foundation revealed itself, it would not do so loudly, it would not require explanation, it would simply exist as it always had, leaving everything built on assumption to settle exactly where it belonged. The following days unfolded with a kind of quiet precision that no one around me seemed to notice, and that was exactly how it needed to be, because nothing about what I was doing required attention, only consistency, and I moved through each interaction with the same calm demeanor I had always carried, answering calls when they came, returning messages with polite warmth, allowing everything to appear unchanged on the surface. When Daniel called 2 days later, his voice carried that familiar tone of casual concern, asking if I had made it home safely, mentioning how busy things had been after the event, how everything had gone so well, and I listened without interrupting, offering simple responses, never correcting, never adding more than what was necessary, because there was no value in revisiting what had already been understood. And when he suggested we meet for lunch sometime the following week, I agreed without hesitation, not because I needed the meeting, but because it allowed the rhythm to continue uninterrupted. Emily followed up with a message later that afternoon, brief but carefully worded, thanking me for coming, mentioning how much she appreciated family support, and I read it once before setting the phone down, recognizing the tone for what it was, controlled, measured, designed to maintain a certain image, and I responded in kind, a simple acknowledgement, nothing more. Nothing that would disrupt the balance they believed was still in place. Inside the house, everything remained exactly as it had been, the same routines, the same quiet mornings, the same careful order that had always defined my days. But beneath that routine, each action now carried intention, each decision aligned with something larger that did not need to be spoken aloud. I sorted through small things that had been left unattended, organizing, updating, adjusting details that most people would consider insignificant, yet I understood how those details connected, how they formed a structure that extended far beyond what was visible, and I made sure that structure reflected exactly what I intended it to, not what anyone else assumed it to be. When I stepped outside to collect the mail, I noticed how unchanged the neighborhood felt, the same houses, the same quiet street, neighbors moving through their routines without awareness of the shifts happening just beneath the surface of my own life. And there was something grounding in that, something that reinforced the idea that not everything needed to be visible to be real. Later that evening, I sat in the living room with the television on low, not watching, simply allowing the sound to fill the space while my thoughts remained steady, not drifting, not questioning, only aligning with what had already been set in motion. And I realized then how different this felt from the past, how there was no urgency, no need to resolve anything immediately, because resolution was no longer dependent on conversation or agreement. It was already unfolding in ways that did not require acknowledgement from anyone else. When the weekend arrived, Daniel and Emily posted photos from the event, images of smiling faces, raised glasses, carefully captured moments that presented everything as complete, as successful, as if nothing had been missing, and I looked at them briefly before setting the phone aside, because I understood now that what was shown and what was true were not always the same, and it was not my responsibility to correct that perception. Instead, I continued as I had been, maintaining the same quiet presence, the same steady pace. Because the most important changes were already in place, even if they had not yet revealed themselves, and as each day passed, I could feel that quiet certainty deepen, not as anticipation, but as assurance, because whatever they believed they had secured, whatever future they had begun to imagine for themselves, it was built on something they had never fully examined, and when that reality surfaced, it would not come as an argument, it would not arrive with explanation, it would simply exist, leaving everything else to adjust around it exactly as it was meant. 2. The lunch was set for a quiet restaurant just outside the city, the kind of place Daniel used to favor when he wanted a conversation to feel relaxed and unforced, and when I arrived, he was already there, seated by the window, his phone placed neatly beside his glass of water, his posture composed but not entirely at ease, and I noticed that small detail immediately, the way his shoulders held a slight tension. As if something beneath the surface had begun to shift, even if he could not yet name it. He stood when he saw me, offering a polite smile, the same one I had seen at the event, practiced, controlled, and I returned it just as calmly before taking my seat across from him, the sunlight filtering through the glass casting a soft reflection across the table between us. For a moment, we spoke about ordinary things, the weather, his work, how busy everything had been. The conversation moving along familiar lines as if nothing had changed, and I allowed it to unfold that way. Answering simply, never pushing, never redirecting, because what mattered now was not what was being said, but what was beginning to surface on its own. It happened gradually, almost imperceptibly at first, a slight hesitation when the server asked about the check, a brief pause when Daniel reached for his phone and then set it back down again, and then, finally, he cleared his throat lightly, his expression shifting just enough to signal that he was moving away from the script he had prepared. "Mom, I wanted to ask you something," he said, his tone careful, measured, and I looked at him without interruption, giving him the space to continue. He glanced down briefly before meeting my eyes again. "There have been some delays with a few things, paperwork, transfers, nothing major, just unexpected." And I listened, noting the words he chose, how he avoided specifics, how he framed everything as temporary, manageable, and I nodded once, not to confirm understanding, but to acknowledge that I had heard him. He continued, explaining how he and Emily had been reviewing some arrangements, how certain assumptions did not seem to align with what they were now being told, and there it was, the first clear indication that something had begun to unravel, not dramatically, not all at once, but in small, precise ways that could not be ignored. I picked up my glass, taking a measured sip before setting it back down, my movements steady, unhurried, and I spoke only after he had finished, my voice calm, even. "Things have a way of becoming clearer when you take a closer look," I said, not as a correction, not as a challenge, but as a simple observation, and for a moment he seemed unsure how to respond, as if he had expected resistance, explanation, something more direct, but found none. The rest of the meal continued in a similar rhythm, conversation moving back to safer topics, though the ease from earlier had not fully returned, and I could see it in the way he checked his phone more frequently now, the way his attention drifted just slightly, as if part of him was already elsewhere, trying to understand something that had not yet fully revealed itself. When the check arrived, he reached for it automatically, but there was a brief pause before he handed over his card, a small hesitation that spoke louder than any words he had used, and I noticed it without reacting, because it confirmed what I already knew. The shift had begun, not in a way that could be easily explained, but in a way that would continue, step by step, until everything aligned with what had already been set in place. When we stood to leave, he walked me to my car, offering a brief embrace that felt more uncertain than before, and as he stepped back, he looked as though he wanted to say something else, something more direct, but he did not. And I did not prompt him, because there was nothing that needed to be said at that moment. I got into my car and closed the door, and as I drove away, I did not look back, not out of distance, but out of understanding, because whatever questions had begun to form in his mind would find their answers soon enough, not through confrontation, not through explanation, but through the simple, undeniable reality that was already unfolding beneath the surface, steady, precise, and entirely beyond what they had expected. The call came 3 days later, not in the morning when people are composed and prepared, but in the late afternoon, when the day has already worn down whatever certainty they thought they had, and I saw Daniel's name on the screen before it even rang a second time, his voice coming through with a tension he could no longer disguise. "Mom, we need to talk," he said, and there was no attempt at casual tone this time, no effort to soften what he was about to say, and I simply answered, "I am listening," allowing the silence on my end to remain steady while he searched for the right words on his. He spoke quickly at first, explaining how they had followed up on the paperwork, how they had contacted the necessary offices, how what they had been told did not match what they believed to be true, and then his voice slowed, each word more deliberate than the last. "The house, it is not set up the way we thought," and I could almost picture him standing somewhere, pacing perhaps, trying to reconcile what he was hearing with what he had assumed for so long, and I let him continue without interruption, because this was not a moment that needed guidance, it needed space. He mentioned accounts, structures, arrangements that did not align with his expectations, and there was something in his tone now that had not been there before, not frustration, not even anger, but uncertainty, the kind that comes when the ground beneath you does not shift suddenly, but reveals that it was never where you thought it was to begin with. When he finally paused, as if waiting for me to explain, to clarify, to correct whatever misunderstanding he believed had occurred, I responded in the same calm voice I had used throughout, "Everything is exactly as it was arranged. I said, not offering more, not expanding, because there was nothing to add that would make it clearer than it already was. There was a long silence on the line after that, one that stretched just enough to carry weight, and when he spoke again, his voice had changed, softer now, but edged with something unfamiliar. Emily thought, we both thought. And the sentence did not finish, because it did not need to. The assumption was clear, the expectation that everything would naturally move into their hands, that time and proximity had already secured what had never actually been given. I stood by the window as he spoke, looking out at the quiet street, the same one that had not changed through any of this, and I realized how different this moment felt from what it might have been in the past. There was no need to defend, no need to justify. No need to remind him of history or effort or sacrifice, because none of that was part of what mattered now. The only thing that mattered was what had always been true, whether they had chosen to see it or not. He asked then, more directly, what this meant going forward, what they were supposed to do, and I allowed a brief pause before answering, not to create tension, but to ensure that what I said would be heard exactly as intended. That depends on what you decide to build for yourselves, I replied, and for a moment, there was no response, as if the simplicity of the answer had caught him off guard. Because it did not offer a solution, it did not restore what he thought had been lost, it simply placed responsibility where it had always belonged. The conversation ended shortly after that, not abruptly, but without resolution, without the kind of closure people expect when they believe something can be negotiated back into place. And when I set the phone down, the house felt as it always had, quiet, steady, unchanged by the shift that had just taken place elsewhere. Later that evening, I moved through my routine without interruption, preparing a simple dinner, setting the table for one, the same way I had done countless times before. But this time there was no underlying question, no lingering doubt, only a clear understanding of where everything stood. Across town, I imagined conversations unfolding, voices raised or lowered in uncertainty, pieces being re-examined, assumptions being tested against something they could not reshape, and I did not feel satisfaction in that, not in the way people might expect, because this was not about winning or losing, it was about alignment. About allowing what was true to remain in place without distortion. As I turned off the lights and made my way upstairs, I paused briefly at the same staircase where I had stood before, my hand resting lightly on the banister, and I looked out across the quiet space that had once held so many shared moments, and I understood something then with complete clarity. I had not taken anything from them, I had simply chosen not to give away what was never theirs to begin with, and in that decision, quiet as it was, everything else had followed exactly as it was meant to.